What's up, everyone, and welcome back to Star Wars Explained. Today, we have a guest that I'm very excited to speak to, the author of the brand new book, The Eye of Darkness, kicking off Phase 3 of the High Republic. George Mann is here with us. Thank you so much, George. How are you doing?
I'm good, thank you. Thanks for having me, Alex.
Well, congratulations on the book. When this video comes out, it will be out today. So
Thank you.
I'm
Yeah.
sure that's a huge relief.
Oh, it is. It is. I mean, you write these things well in advance, and then it's a long waiting game while you're waiting for it to cycle through and finally hit. Waiting to hear what people think and how well the book's received. Hopefully people are going to be enjoying it and rushing out today to buy it.
Well, I've been a big fan of the High Republic since it started, and the Eye of Darkness was no different. Really great kind of reintroduction back to the Phase 1 characters and situations. Before we start talking about it, and by the way, today's video interview will be spoiler-free, so no one has to worry about that. But I like to ask everyone that I interview a little icebreaker question, just to get to know you as a Star Wars fan a little bit better. But who is your favorite lesser known Star Wars character, or maybe concept or ship, or basically anything? What's something in Star Wars that you have found yourself really attached to?
Yeah, I mean, there's a few. It's a difficult question actually in some ways because there's so many. And before before Ahsoka, I probably would have talked about Sabine because and Chopper actually as well because they're two of my favorite characters from all of Star Wars. But obviously they're not really lesser known. And I guess one of my others would be Dexter Jettster.
Mm-hmm.
I think again, he's growing in stature as well as in size over the years. But I adored him from his very first appearance in Attack of the Clones, and that scene with Obi-Wan. It's just such a great moment of light relief in the middle of the film, and it's been brilliant seeing him kind of gain a new life among the expanded kind of world of Star Wars. With I wrote a story in Insider, but kind of more importantly, Daniel's been using him in High Republic Adventures through Phase 2, showing kind of his origins as a prospector and how he's obviously long lived, and how his character develops. So yeah, I think he's a character who deserves even more attention.
You're right. He has been growing in stature as of late. He's been a popular answer, but he just seems like that guy that has a story for everything and has been everywhere and done it all. So,
I think that's the thing. He's like, I suppose he's a bit of an archetype. He's almost like that barman who's been there and seen it and done it all before. He's not weary with the universe yet, but he knows what the universe is like or the galaxy's like out there. That's kind of how I feel about his character, and I want to hear some of those stories about those adventures.
Speaking of archetypes, I feel like that's a good segue into my next topic. In your About the Author section of The Eye of Darkness, you say that you're a big mythology and folklore lover. Over the past year, I've been trying to get more and more into mythology. Ahsoka also helped to drive that. It was very mythologically inspired. Do you have a favorite mythology besides Star Wars?
Yeah, well, lots. I mean, I think if you're looking at kind of real world mythology, I'd probably talk about the Arthurian tradition. The classic kind of La Morte d'Arthur and the Lady in the Lake, and going back to the origin of all those stories. And we're very lucky in the UK. We have a good historical tradition of folklore and mythology, and you get to visit these places. Like one of my deepest joys was visiting Tintagel, which is said to be the site of Camelot, and climbing up onto it's on a cliffside, this ruined castle on a cliffside in Cornwall. Being able to climb up there and stand in the footsteps of those people, and I'm under no illusion that Arthur was real, or certainly not in the way he was being painted, but actually it's just the stories have such a resonance. And I think a resonance that actually feeds into Star Wars, that idea of kind of knights and chivalry and, the round table Feels very kind of much kind of where the George Lucas was looking when he was coming up with the Jedi Order and the Jedi Knights. So yeah, so that, but also, I mean, there's a novel series, fantasy novel series by Stephen Erickson called the Malazan Book of the Fallen, and it's quite an investment in terms of time. The books are like 1,000 pages each or more, and there's 10 of them. But he's a kind of an anthropologist and archaeologist, as well as being an amazing writer. So what he does really, really well is imbue his fictional universe with a really deep history, because he knows about deep time, and he's studied Neanderthals and early man and the development of cultures, and he folds all of that into this fictional world as well. So the undead in his world are not recent skeletons; they're 10,000, 100,000 years old. From old cultures. So it's kind of, I don't know, you can lose yourself in that series. And it's what's remarkable about it is that it's a world that he created with his best friend, who's also an archaeologist and an anthropologist and a writer. So Erickson wrote these 10 novels, and then his friend Ian Esselmont has written 6 novels, also set in the same universe, and they all interrelate to each other. And then they're both writing prequels and sequel series as well, and it's just growing and growing. So that's a mythology that I'm very fond of. Not quite the same because it's fictional, but it does have that depth that you look for in folklorish tradition.
It sounds like something that would be up a Star Wars fan's alley as well.
I think it would be, yeah, absolutely.
Well, how has your love of mythology and maybe specifically Arthurian legend prepared you to write in a universe like Star Wars? It's funny you say that, because I remember when they first announced the High Republic, they talked about it being kind of like the Jedi Knights of the Round Table.
Yeah. No, absolutely. I think that's something I very much try to keep in mind. And I think, first of all, I suppose, I mean, the reason I ended up writing Star Wars was because of my love of mythology, because Michael C. Glaine, creative director at Lucasfilm, had read one of my original novels, Witchwood, which is a murder mystery, modern day murder mystery, but it has the character, the killer in the story, is enacting these kind of murder scenes as if they were stills from a mythology that he's kind of playing out, an old Anglo-Saxon mythology. That and Mike had approached me and said, really enjoyed the book. Did you create all of that story of that kind of, or was it real Anglo-Saxon mythology? And I said, no, I created it. And he said, well, would you like to do that for Star Wars? Yes, please. So that's how I ended up doing the Myths and Fables series of books. And that's really where I started to kind of really look at the connection between Star Wars and mythology, because what is Star Wars but a mythology that's been building over decades. One of the richest mythologies of the modern times, but yeah, it has its root in those traditions. So in those stories, I was kind of looking back at classic folklore traditions and bringing them forward into Star Wars. So I wanted to do the same when I kind of got into the High Republic, and be aware of that kind of sense of world building that comes with. I suppose it's as much about a weight of history and culture that's developed, so that you're not presenting. They're not just modern people in the Star Wars world, although there is an element to that because you want them to be relatable. But they're also people who should feel rooted in the world they live in, and that world has its own history and its own cultures. So I'm always trying to make sure I'm bringing some of that into what I do. But with Eye of Darkness, obviously, we're not talking spoilers today, but we're at a point where the Jedi are, they're on the back foot. That Markin Rowe has very much won, and they are not acting like the Jedi of the Round Table. They're pulling in different directions. Some of they can't decide on how to tackle the problem because, Markin Rowe has the Nameless. He has the ultimate weapon against the Jedi, and yeah, they're running scared. Some of them want to go all out attack. Some of them want to kind of knuckle down on research and try and find a way around the problem. Some of them want to take diplomatic routes. So instead of pulling together like an order, they're more fragmentary and acting as individuals, even within the framework of the order. And that's something I wanted to that's the picture I wanted to paint at the start of this phase. Because obviously they're on a trajectory. We're telling a bigger story, and they have to learn to come together again to be able to win. So I was very conscious of that. Kind of, what will King Arthur's table look like if everyone was pulling in different directions?
You got my head spinning with questions for the spoilers section. That we'll do that in a couple weeks. But you did also mention your work in the myths and fables and dark legends and those compilations. How was it approaching some of those stories that are kind of in universe stories versus writing for the High Republic, which is something that spans generations?
Yeah, I mean, so it's a very different writing experience, because with those stories, you're trying to think about how is that story transmuted through time, I guess. So my approach with the myths and fables stories was always to go, okay, there's a kernel of truth here. Something happened, but we're not going to tell the story as it happened. We're going to tell the story as it's been retold over centuries, perhaps, or at least years. And obviously stories get embellished in the telling, they change in the telling. Different characters are transposed in, names are forgotten, names are misspelt, So that's how you end up with Darth Vader as the boogeyman, or Obi-Wan fighting a crate dragon, which is actually a big dragon, with wings. And it's like, what the way I like to look at those stories is, well, there was something did happen. Obi-Wan probably did fight a crate dragon to save a village of Tuscan people, but over time that story has mutated and in the retelling, and now it's kind of in the version that you get in the book. So that was kind of the approach with all of those myths and fables type stories, that I wanted them to have the feel as if they were Grimm's fairy stories. They were the things that Luke or Leia might be told at bedtime in that format, in that way. Whereas with the High Republic, obviously, you're omniscient as a narrator telling a story. It's a bit more immediate. You're in the characters' heads. You're feeling what they're feeling. With Eye of Darkness, particularly, I really wanted to get deep inside those characters' heads and spend some time exploring their characters, where they're at, where they need to be, what this trauma has done to them. And kind of explore that in a way you can't in a myth. A myth or a fable always it's a moral story. It's always got a twist in the tail and a moral. And I think that overall the High Republic fits that shape. It's like Star Wars, like the Skywalker series of films. There's lessons to be learned across the films. There's a bigger story being told. But on a kind of individual book level, this was my chance to go, all right, this is a character study of some of those key characters who we've met and loved in phase one. And being able to kind of go, okay, we're back now, but everyone's not quite in the place where you remember them.
And can I just say, it's some of my favorite thing to read your myths or fables or any story like that in Star Wars, where you're like, I think some of this is true. Like even some of the Lego specials.
Yeah.
I like to be like, okay, what in here maybe really did happen? Do you ever go into that with notes in your head of like, okay, here's what I think is maybe true, and then expand on that? Like, especially with a bunch of the Sith you've created, are super fun.
Yeah. So I mean, in my head, so Darth Kaldoth, is the Sith who reappears multiple times, is a character who I think, certainly in my head, he definitely existed. Whether all the stories that are told about him are true is a different thing. In fact, there's tiny bit of a spoiler here, not for Eye of Darkness, but I wrote the series of stories I did for phase 2 for the Star Wars Insider, the Tales of Enlightenment. there's a final story, a new, like an additional story that's in the collection, an original to the collection, and it's kind of a cipher to how I write the myths and fable stories. There's a moment in it where a story is being told. You know, I don't know if you've read any of those stories, but yeah. So the way they work is, character rolls into a bar, tells a story, essentially. And in this one, the same thing happens. A character who you might not be expecting, who's telling a story about a character you might not be expecting, and at the end, one of the kind of the barflies turns to that character and says, "Was that story real?" And the person who's told the story says, "Well, it was really a story," and that's kind of, and leaves it at that. And it's kind of like, oh, okay, so you just you don't know, but I also think that's true of I have a view of canon that the kind of there is no canon, that every story is as valid as any other, because it's a story told in that universe, and in the way that we tell stories all the time in our daily lives, or we read novels, or we watch movies, or we play video games. Who's to say those stories aren't valid or true? And that's the way I look at canon. So I don't mean in the sense of like writing the High Republic. Obviously, we're telling a specific story with specific boundaries, but I like to think of like canon as a mutable thing. Doctor Who is one of the other brands that I've written a lot for, and it because it's a time travel story essentially. It's so freeing because actually, the Doctor's been to Pompeii 3, 4, 5 times during the course of, because lots of different writers have gone, oh, that's a great setup for a Doctor Who story. We're taking to Pompeii, last day of Pompeii. But actually, they can all be true, because in a time travel story, you can just overwrite each other. But actually, I also like to think that they're all valid stories that have been told and passed down the centuries, and who knows what really happened the day the Doctor visited Pompeii. And I think that's the way I like to think about the myths and fables type stories in Star Wars as well. It's like, well, something definitely happened, and there's definitely a kernel of truth in this story. But until we get a more definitive version of those events, in a book like The Eye of Darkness or any of the other kind of novels, they're as valid as anything else.
Yeah. That's definitely something, your view on canon, I think lines up with mine, is that it shifted over the years. When I was younger, I like tried to make everything fit and like, no, this all works. But now I'm kind of like, all right, in some cases, we know that Han and Greedo sat down at a table and Han walked up. He got back up and walked away. Who shot first? I don't know. It depends on who's telling the story.
Exactly. I think that's a perfect example of it, because, yeah, exactly. It depends on who's telling the story, and Star Wars is a story, and mythology are stories, and who's to say they don't tell stories within those worlds and mythologies? It wouldn't be a real world if it didn't, and that's what's so great about Star Wars, is it feels real to us.
Yeah. While The Eye of Darkness is your first High Republic novel, it's far from your first High Republic story. You mentioned your short stories, and also you wrote for Phase 2, but I wanted to talk about some of the children's book adaptations you did. For example, you wrote the kids' book version of The Rising Storm, which is one of the bleakest Star Wars books I've ever read. What's it like to adapt that? Like, did you read The Rising Storm and you were like, Kevin, how do I do this?
Yeah, well, I mean, I was very lucky to be, although I wasn't part of the initial 5 writers, I was very lucky to be brought in on the High Republic quite early because of those books and because of the Drengir story I wrote for Dark Legends. And I think Mike always had a plan to bring me in for Phase 2. So I was reading a lot. I'd kind of read all the background material, and I was reading all the novels as they were arriving in manuscript form. So I'd kind of read the book, and yeah, I mean, obviously, there's a lot of dark stuff that happens in that book. It's definitely not a children's book, but I think that's the beauty of Star Wars. Actually, is that it works for everyone on different levels. A 4-year-old wants to see Star Wars on their screen, and they want to click on it and watch the movie or watch the cartoon, or but so does a 12-year-old, and so does a 18-year-old, and so does a 46-year-old, and so does a 86-year-old. It's and how you cut the story just depends on the audience you're writing for. The obvious thing to do in that circumstance was to tell a story about Burry, because he's the fluffy bear to a 4-year-old kid. That's the fluffy Wookiee. But you can tell a story within that framework of a disaster without having to, the pirates are bad people doing a terrible thing. Well, that happens in real life. I mean, there's worse stuff on the daily news that the kid could happen across than that. So you don't have to provide much more context than that to say the baddies are hurting people, and this is our hero who's going to protect them. And then that hero needs to learn a lesson, because the whole point in that hero learning a lesson is that the kid is the hero in that circumstance. That's how they're learning that lesson alongside the hero. So that's the kind of approach that you take with that type of book. So it wasn't easy, but I also kind of went, well, actually, in some ways it is easy, because there's loads of families on fallow at that time visiting the fair. There's disasters are happening, so we can get some kid POVs in there, because and there's just civilian kids visiting the fair and something goes horribly wrong, and then this Jedi appears to help them and save them, and then what's the lesson that they're going to learn in that process. And you can kind of take a slice out of the story that it's true to the tone of the bigger piece that you're kind of reworking, but loses all of the horrible context that isn't appropriate for the age group.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, you didn't really have to worry about that when it came to writing The Eye of Darkness.
No.
When you were planning Phase 3, what thoughts ran through your head when you found out you were going to write the first novel?
I mean, a little bit of trepidation. Quite honoured to be given the opportunity to kind of get my teeth into something really meaty and launch a new phase. And excitement as well. I mean, it's like I'd written some bits and bobs for Phase 1. For Phase 2, I wrote a children's novel. I wrote the Battle of Jedi. I wrote a comic series. Wrote short stories. I've done a lot, but I hadn't got my hands on Avar and Elzar and Bell and Burry, in a meaty way. So I was just chomping at the bit to do that. It's like referring back to what I was saying earlier. It's like I'm a fan, and I'd read those books as a fan, and then being able to then go, right, now I'm going to write stories about these guys. It's like, well, what can I say about them? What can I do that's interesting with them? How can I add to their overall story? So it's kind of like, it was a mix of kind of a little bit of trepidation and a lot of excitement.
That's you reminded me of The Nameless Terror from Phase 2, your comic, and that was something like, it's an all ages comic, but still, there were some later panels and issues where I was like, oh my gosh, like I was surprised at what you got away with.
Well, no, absolutely. I mean, I've written a fair amount for kids now, and I think the thing I've learned is not to write down to them.
Mm-hmm.
They're not necessarily naive. They just need things presenting in a different way, and what I found is the way to do that is to present it through children's eyes. So I'm writing a YA book at the moment, Tears of the Nameless, which we can talk about in the future. But actually, again, the approach is that you kind of go, okay, well, your main characters are the characters of the age of the readers, or usually just a little bit older than the readers. And so, you don't change the story, you don't change what happens. You pan away if there's too much blood and guts and things like that, but actually that's not really the meat of it. What you're doing is you're telling a story from their perspective, how they feel about what's happening, the events that are happening around them, how their experiences color that perspective, and what their concerns are as younger people. That older people might have different concerns. So I think if you can get yourself in the head of that age group and write from that character's perspective, then the story is just the same. It's just, you know, you're exploring it from a younger person's point of view.
Well, I think we're about ready to wrap up for today. But like I said, this interview is going to come out on the day the Eye of Darkness releases. So without spoilers, what are you most excited for High Republic fans to experience within it?
The new status quo, I think. You know, how things have changed in the year since we last saw our heroes and villains. How the galaxy has been reshaped. But also, I just can't wait to see their reactions to getting back to some of these much loved characters as well, and finding out what Avar's been up to, what Elza's been up to, what Bell and Burry are doing. You know, we're seeing little glimpses of some of that in stories in Tales of Light and Life and comics. But this is the kind of the first big step into Phase 3. So you're going to learn a lot about where these characters are at and kind of where their heads are at. And I'm really interested to see how people find that.
Well, I found it to be very exciting. I really, really loved reading it. I love this era. You're all doing great work. Before we wrap up, where can people follow you online? And what non-Star Wars stories have you written that you think Star Wars fans might enjoy?
Good questions. Instagram's a good place. I'm at George Mann author. I'm still on Twitter, or X as it's now known, George_Mann. They're probably the best two places. Instagram is where I'd point people to. And other books. I think if people are interested in kind of the mythological work that I've done, I think these books, the Newbery and Hobbs books, there's kind of 6 novels in this series, as well as a short story collection and a graphic novel. And they are kind of steampunky Victorian horror infused stories, kind of slight kind of supernatural elements to, well, actually not that slight, supernatural elements to them. They're kind of a mishmash of all my favorite kind of TV shows when I was a kid. So Sherlock Holmes, Doctor Who, the Hammer horror movies. But because of the and it's set in an alternate world, so it's 1902, but it's not quite as history had it. And I think, you know, it's an early glimpse. I started those books in 2008. I finished them last year. It's been with me for a long time, and it's an early glimpse in kind of my world building and mythologizing and creation of a kind of fictional history.
Great. Well, thank you again so much for taking some time out of your day to speak with us, non-spoilery today. In a couple weeks, we'll have you back and we'll talk spoilers about the Eye of Darkness.
Looking forward to it. Thanks for having me.
All right. Thanks everyone for watching, and may the Force be with you.